All right. Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me okay? All right, good. I'm really thankful for the papers thus far. It's been really, really wonderful, and I'm learning a lot, having to take a lot of notes. Fortunately, it's being recorded this time. Sorry? Okay, gotcha. All right. Fortunately, it's being recorded this time, so, I suppose I don't have to take notes during this, but I can go back and watch it. But, all right. Let me just begin here. The title of the paper is called Darkness Radiant. And then I want to distinguish Mother Teresa's darkness, whatever happened with her, with depression. And I get that phrase from when she was speaking about a friend's nephew. Mother Teresa writes, "He will come from his darkness radiant with new light, Christ." In fact, many people, since the publication of Mother Teresa's personal correspondence and the coming to light of her profound, lasting spiritual darkness, many people, missionaries of charities, sisters included, have asked and wondered whether Mother Teresa's affliction or state was depression, or even whether they themselves are in a depression when they experience what appears to be similar symptoms. In this talk, I want to examine precisely this question. Although I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist, I was fortunate during my doctoral studies to receive some kind of graduate education in it. The last thing I wanted to do was say something stupid about something I knew nothing about and be published that way, so hopefully I don't do that here. I knew nothing about it, so I took graduate level courses in psychology and neuroscience department. I attended and presented at a weekly lab meeting. I shadowed a clinical psychologist during the summer. I'm still not a psychologist, but fortunately, one does not need to be a practicing clinician in order to do philosophy of psychology, any more than one needs to be an athlete to do philosophy of sport. And if you've ever asked, say, whether NASCAR or cheerleading is a sport, or karate, or God forbid, e-sports is a sport, then you're doing philosophy of sport, right? You don't have to be an athlete in order to do that. I just hope I don't say anything stupid about, you have to know a little bit about what you're talking about. All right. Now, in the following, when I compare and contrast Mother Teresa's spiritual darkness with depression, I'll be assuming the current model, the overwhelmingly dominant model for depression today, the biophysicochemical or medical model. That is the classical MDD, major depressive disorder, as understood by the DSM-5, the APA, and so on. Now, I do have this sort of an aside to make here. This is not what I'm doing here, but if you want to have a discussion as to whether depression, let's say, is actually more than this, broadening the concept of depression to include religious spiritual models and so on, we can certainly entertain that, but that would change what I would end up saying with respect to judgment on whether her darkness was a depression of that kind. I hope that makes sense, right? There are such models out there, but that's not a very common sort of thing, right? All right, so we're only focusing on whether darkness and depression whether her darkness was depression in the biochemical or psychological sense, as it is so often succinctly yet unfortunately characterized, as you probably have heard of, a chemical imbalance, something like that. So that's the aim. Now, one important caveat before we begin: it is a near fool's errand to attempt to diagnose a historical figure. And it's weird to say that Mother Teresa is a historical figure, because so many, have met her that are with us today. But such historical figures, they're no longer with us. They can't really tell us what's going on with them. Then again, when you're thinking about depression, all depression diagnoses are based on self-report. There is no blood test for depression, as of right now anyway, that we know of. There's no lab test that can be ordered that can directly and definitively determine whether you have it. On the contrary, you'll see that you'll be answering questionnaires, right? They'll be asking, in the last 2 weeks or so, have you experienced the following symptoms? And of course, this has its pluses and minuses, but this means you need to be moderately self-reflective to be able to determine and discern whether you have experienced such things. But now, we do have self-report via talk therapy. We have self-report via questionnaires to determine depression. No lab reports, no blood tests. All we need is self-report, and we have Mother Teresa's lasting self-report. We'll look at this first, Mother Teresa's affliction in her own words. Then I want to examine Mother Teresa's affliction in light of Father Thomas Dubé's help. Is it Dubé or Dubai? Dubé? Because my autocorrect wants to change it to Dubai all the time. Helpful schema. He provides criteria to distinguish between a mental or emotional problem on the one hand and a dark, purifying night on the other. Finally, I'll say more about the notion of the dark night of the soul very briefly, again using Mother Teresa's own words as a guide. And then I'll conclude here with a few brief remarks about the wonderful academic work to be done in this nascent field of Mother Teresa studies. So, getting on with it, let's look at some of the actual quotes from Mother Teresa. And for this, actually, let me just continue here. The publication of her private writings and correspondence in 2007, 10 years after her death, immediately caused sorrow and confusion in her admirers, and a glee that bordered on what Germans called Schadenfreude, taking pleasures and another's misfortune in her detractors. Continuing, her letters revealed that except for one short period, Teresa had been afflicted with a deep sense of God's absence for the last half century of her life, end quote. Teresa was so deeply impacted by the spiritual darkness that she wrote, quote, "If I ever become a saint, I will certainly be one of darkness. I will continually be absent from heaven to light the light of those in darkness on earth," end quote. Now, if we were to open up the book, which I have with me, and I didn't get your autograph last year, but maybe I can get it this year. I don't know, it slipped my mind or something. And we were to open the book and just trace the chapter headings, for example. You can see, at a bird's eye view, a wonderful sort of layout of her life, and you'll see these periods of darkness, right? Well, that's not entirely chronological one-to-one exactly what happened, but you get the idea. If you look at chapter 9, for example, uses a quote as the title, "My God, how painful is this unknown pain?" And she continues in the same letter, addressed to Jesus undated. It is actually one of the most detailed, longest description of her experience of darkness. And for this, I do think I'm only going to plug in every once in a while, and I'm going to do so now because this is so long of a block quote. But I think this is productive because of what I said earlier about using her own words. This is important. Here we go. I call, I cling, I want. There's no one to answer. No one on whom I can cling. No one. Alone. The darkness is so dark, and I'm alone, unwanted, forsaken. The loneliness of the heart that once loved is unbearable. Where is my faith? Even deep down, right in, there is nothing but emptiness and darkness. My God, how painful is this unknown pain. It pains without ceasing. I have no faith. I dare not utter the words and thoughts that crowd in my heart and make me suffer untold agony. So many unanswered questions live within me. I'm afraid to uncover them because of the blasphemy. If there be God, please forgive me. Trust that all will end in heaven with Jesus. When I try to raise my thoughts to heaven, there is such convicting emptiness that those very thoughts return like sharp knives and hurt my very soul. Love, the word, brings nothing. I am told God loves me, and yet the reality of darkness and coldness and emptiness is so great that nothing touches my soul. The work is not a doubt, because I'm convinced that it is His, not mine. She looks around, the whole time smiling. Sisters and people pass such remarks. They think my faith, trust, and love are filling my very being, and that the intimacy with God and union to His will must be absorbing my heart. Could they but know, and how my cheerfulness is the cloak by which I cover the emptiness and misery. In spite of all, this darkness and emptiness is not as painful as the longing for God. The contradiction I fear will unbalance me. What are you doing, my God, to one so small? When you ask to imprint your passion on my heart, is this the answer? If this brings you glory, if you get a drop of joy from this, if souls are brought to you, if my suffering satiates your thirst, here I am, Lord, with joy. I accept all to the end of life. I will smile at your hidden face always. And there's more and more and more. I hesitate to go on because I've still got to cover so much, but I'll just read from a few. The place of God in my soul is blank. There's no God in me. When the pain of longing is so great, I just long and long for God. And then it is that I feel he does not want me. He is not there. Heaven, souls, why, these are just words which mean nothing to me. My very life seems so contradictory. I help souls to go where? Why all this? Where is the soul in my very being? God does not want me. Now, excuse me, actually, I need that back. Pardon me. Now, it's so heavy and hard to understand. It's certainly hard for Mother Teresa to understand. At this point, I want us to look at Father Dubé's schema, his distinction between what he calls, on the one hand, a mental and emotional problem, and on the other, a dark or purifying night. And of course, he has in mind the dark night of the soul. On the one hand, he has 7 of these criteria that he goes through. On the one hand, the person experiencing the left side would have excessive introspection, self-concern, self-analysis. The person can scarcely get his mind off himself and his problem. Advice does little to remedy this trait, at least at first. The dark purifying night, little or no introspection, once the condition is adequately explained. Little awareness of the problem aside from prayer time. On the left, unrealism. The depressed person's situation is not as dismal and hopeless as he considers it when the problem is depression. And he goes on about self-image. The moral case is not as scrupulous as the person thinks, nor one's worth as the person with a weak self-image supposes. On the other hand, with the dark purifying night, the pains of the dark night are objectively well-founded. We are very imperfect, and we need exactly what is happening. The situation is as unrealistic as a laundry washing machine operation. It's got to go through all the cycles. Number 3, depression. The person with the mental problem often suffers from clinical depression, more or less severe. I feel that he glosses over the question here, but we're going to examine that part a little bit further. On the other side, there's no depression at all. At work, play, meals, the person is as cheerful as is any other period in the spiritual life. 4, many mental problems are difficult to heal. Years of therapy may be needed, and even then, progress may be only partial. On the other side, a competent explanation clears up the anxiety occasioned by the first night. Therapy is, I think this is supposed to be not riot. There we go, fixed it. I think, never mind. Not needed in either night, even if the second must run its course. On the left-hand side, chronic fatigue and or insomnia often accompany the emotional disturbance. And of course, you can see no problem at all on the other side if the dark purifying night is the case. And this should be easy to, again, with each of these criteria, I'm going to compare it to Mother Teresa, and already you should be thinking, are you kidding me? Chronic fatigue, right? She's not one to just, be tired all the time, right? Certainly not a parent. Number 6, fixing attention on studying, reading, or lecture can be impossible. On the other hand, attention at prayer, if you're in the dark night, can be difficult, at times impossible, but there's no attention problem in the rest of life. And then finally, if it's a mental emotional problem, they do not of themselves promote virtue or increase depth of the relationship with God. Whereas we know with the dark night, the nights do of themselves greatly increase love, humility, patience, and the like, and they decidedly prepare one for deeper prayer. All right. Now, let's look at these further. I'll remind you what they say. But some of these we can take in pairs, right? So number 3 and number 5 are easily adjudicated to the right column of just dark night. Number 3, for example, you remember that it was depressive affect. It is not known that Mother ever exhibited any depressive affect in regular life. It was never evident that she ever even suffered from a spiritual darkness, which is why the revelation from her own personal correspondence was so shocking. No one knew. As for number 5, again, chronic fatigue, are you kidding me? Right? I say here, missionaries of charity. I didn't realize how many of you would be here, so please take this with charity. The missionaries of charity are still known for their relentless, unflagging service to the poor. My own parish priest, Father Michael Weibly, a Dominican, regularly says Mass for the missionary sisters in Baltimore. While the Dominicans like to, as he says, worship hard, study hard, and party hard, which by that he means like eat good feasts. the missionary sisters will occasionally join us on feast days, such as St. Dominic's, for the Mass celebration, but to my disappointment, although who am I, we'll never stay for the feast. Like, I want to get to talk to them, but they're back to work. When I asked about it, Father Wively said, he just chuckled amusingly and says, that's the sisters. They ask for nothing from no one, yet get everything they can, with every ounce they can, until they can't give more. And then they give more. We can say the same with respect to number 6. As you'll remember, attention. Because of her untiring service to the poorest of the poor, and especially because of her great devotion to prayer and her ordinary duties, it seems that she did not have such an attention problem. And so we would adjudicate that to the right side column as well. Number two, as you might remember, is it a reasonable or is it objectively well-founded? That's easily adjudicated to the right. We have to assume, of course, the reality of the dark night of the soul first. And assuming the dark night of the soul, that is, assuming Mother Teresa was indeed going through a dark night, then of course her pains would be objectively founded, right? So that one's kind of a wash, but we'll go on. Number 7 is something we began with. Depression in and of itself. Does that promote virtue or increase depth of relationship with God? Now, we're not saying could it, we're saying about the condition itself. Does it in and of itself promote virtue? And I'd have to say no. This is why it's called a disorder or a disease, right? You see the lack of ordering, being unordered. While we know that, of course, on the other side, the dark night of the soul does greatly increase love, humility, patience, and the like. This is almost Mother Teresa's own description. We know how she accepted and came to love the darkness and how it led to her growth in love of Christ. Therefore, this we must also adjudicate to the right side column. Finally, numbers 1 and 4 can be taken together. Number 1, as you might recall, excessive introspection, self-concern, or self-analysis, right? Is that going on, or is there little to none going on once the condition is explained? Well, number 1, there's no evidence that Mother Teresa experienced any excessive rumination, obsession, or unhealthy introspection. We don't mean introspective prayer. That would be a good thing. We mean unhealthy introspection, especially once the problem was explained to her. Mother did ask for, in Father Dubé's words here, a competent explanation when she asks why to one of her few close confidants, especially in terms of her darkness. Her confessor, Father Pikaki. Is it Pikaki? Pikaki? Pikachi. All right. Yeah. Autocorrect kept wanting to change that to Pikachu. Pikachi? All right. Father Pikachi. Though generally resigned to her interior trial, she could not help asking Father Pikachi in a particular letter, quote, "Tell me, Father, why is there so much pain and darkness in my soul? Sometimes I find myself saying I can't bear it any longer. With the same breath, I say, I'm sorry, do with me what you wish." End quote. While it's undoubtedly still a struggle, continually struggling to understand, let alone to experience, and while, as Father Brian says in his book, it would have been legitimate under the circumstances to seek help or relief. End quote. However, out of obedience, Teresa's concerns were put to rest. We know this. As she writes in a later, separate letter to the same Father Pikachi, quote, "I've gone and am still going through hard spiritual trials, but in this point, there has never been a doubt in my soul, because I have always put them before you and Father Van Exum, and each time your yes or no has satisfied me as the will of God." End quote. Though difficult, any mystery about the nature of her affliction was resolved. She didn't really ruminate on it. Now, excuse me. Now, the next section of this paper is something that I spoke very briefly. I'll speak only very briefly about it here. Last year, I spoke more at length about it and had a PowerPoint with it, but I won't get into it too in detail that much. We know from Father Dubé's schema that it's either going to be a mental emotional problem, in his terms, or a dark purifying night. And as far as St. John of the Cross is concerned, there really are just those two nights, just the night of the senses and the night of the soul, right? So was Mother going through a dark night of the soul, such as St. John of the Cross? And I appreciate, was it Rachel's paper on challenging whether this is a reparative night? Because I think it's a reparative night, at least in what I've seen so far. I could be convinced otherwise. And the case for that goes a little like this. First of all, she herself did not think she was experiencing a dark night of the soul. She had read St. John of the Cross and found him very lovely. I think was her words. But he writes very lovely, but didn't consider herself to identify with whatever that was as far as experientially. And so if we take that seriously, again, just listening to the words, listening to their own self-report, that has to weigh a little heavily, right? Secondly, the case goes like this. St. John of the Cross died in his 40s and seems to, at least in the prologue to the Ascent/Dark Night work, because it's two of the same, seems to have left it unfinished. And in the prologue, he seems to be motioning towards a three-part ascent, or a three-part night, that is, rather than just a two-part night. And so later, Catholic theologians like Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange took this on, and in the Catholic tradition is very familiar with this reparative suffering, right? You still have this overwhelming kind of darkness or night, but it's not, the purpose of it is not to purify or purgate one's own senses or one's own consolation of God's felt presence. The purpose, not in order to purgate one's own, right, sinfulness, but in order to be on behalf of others' own sinfulness, right? It's done on behalf of others. And so that would be another point in favor of thinking of this as a reparative night. Now, I could expand upon that further and certainly leave time in the Q&A for that, but yeah, we'll continue. All right. Let me actually now apply this to our current goal. All right. I wanted to do something that was on the darkness that Mother experienced, and then challenge the idea of whether that was depression. And in so doing, we can also, and I think in the extended version of this paper, I'm also going to compare it just to the DSM criteria. Right? The DSM-5 criteria are things like, do you exhibit, in the last 4 weeks or something, sad affect or irritability or something like that, and it's got to go on for a certain time. It seems very arbitrary and so on, but it's used as a heuristic. It's used as a tool in order to judge, what are we seeing, but by this, and there's different kind of, things according to which you can have a greater or lesser depression. But as I said, in an earlier section, I don't. Even if it were on a spectrum, as they say, greater or lesser degree, it seems that she's not even close to even barely having a depression that's visible, right? And now there is this sense of a masked depression, right? And if you'd like to talk about that in the Q&A, that's totally fine. Or it's like a hidden depression or a masked depression, such that the depressed person won't show very evidently in their normal life. They'll be happy. But then in their own private life, they will be suffering internally, right? All right, now to our current goal. As I said, wanted this talk to be about that, but I also want to talk more fundamentally about the project of the Institute, that of launching and broadening the fledgling category of academic studies on Mother Teresa. So a little more about me. I was honored and floored even when Father Brian invited me to be a part of the Mother Teresa Institute, both this year's colloquium and last year's colloquium and panel discussion. I initially, of course, thought it had to be a mistake. Because I was like, are there other people named Derek McAllister out there? I'm not an expert on Mother Teresa. But as my friend likes to say, there's this thing as imposter syndrome. I'm sure you may have heard of it or not, right? He likes to say this with respect to impostor. He also is a fellow academic. He says, "It's my fault for sending my dumb paper. It's their fault for accepting it." So when I was asked back a second time, I felt honored, of course, again, but this time more assured that I had something to offer and something to contribute and could be a part of this. And let me talk a little bit more about that. You see, as an academic, my research scope, not being a Mother Teresa expert, my research scope, as you heard, includes depression and conceptual depression in the context of philosophy. So thus far, it's barely touched upon Mother Teresa. I'd included her in my doctoral dissertation on the conceptual history of depression in a chapter on the dark night of the soul. So I suppose that makes me one of the few people, relatively speaking, not with respect to this room, who are doing academic work, let's say, academic writing on Mother Teresa. On the other hand, as far as I can see, of course, considering the charism of the missionaries of charity, with emphasis on poverty and service, while they're intimately acquainted with the life and work of Mother Teresa, there are only a few of them doing any academic writing. So there's this little tiny overlap, right, where you have people doing academic writing that don't really talk about Mother Teresa, and Mother Teresa people who don't really, well, in general, do academic writings, right? That's the overlap that this institute seeks to fill, right? There's so much work still to be done. And this is just from my notes, and I'm glad nobody else has talked about it, so I can claim it. I remember I took notes right here from last year's roundtable, and I'd like to share some of the findings with you. So the work Come Be My Light, for all its fundamental and necessary contributions, did not attempt a theology of darkness, or its opposite, a theology of light, if you prefer it, right? This mystical martyrdom, that is, her lack of interior consolation, her greatest suffering, can be explored further in terms of both, and here I'll start just naming, I'll put up a finger whenever I start saying disciplines, all right? So if you consider theology of darkness a discipline, I guess that'll be one. Two, it can be considered in terms of both of speculative theology and practical or lived theology. Teresa's namesake, St. Therese, was named by John Paul II, a doctor of the church, in Divini Amoris Scientia, the science of divine love. That love, quote, which the Father of mercies pours out through Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit, end quote. St. Therese, herself a teacher of that love. It is well worth examining at a practical level Mother Teresa in this same light, for the mystics are important theologians. From the perspective of, here's another discipline, spiritual theology. The harvest is ripe for the fields of, let me just go rapid fire here, world history and interreligious dialogue, right? Albanian Catholics in the early 1900s or religious conflict in India. I'll use both hands for this. Psychology and counseling and spiritual formation. For example, experiencing the understanding of one's own suffering and surrendering and uniting it to Christ. Or, for example, the felt perceived absence of God's presence despite one's own burning desire for him. All that could be explored there. Other fields, social ethics and theological ethics. For example, how we care for the least of these, abortion, the sick, the poor, and so on. The fields of, I don't have more than 10 fingers, but 11, medicine and healthcare, of course, especially hospice and palliative care. All these fields can be applied to Mother Teresa studies. The field of hagiography is the study of saints, especially simple saints, as they are so called, like St. Therese and St. Francis, and many, many more. Those are just the disciplines. Let me talk about topics of special interest to Mother Teresa. These also raise their heads. For one, the threefold emphasis of missionaries of charity. The threefold emphasis, that would just be number one, but it has three parts. That's a good example of the Trinity there. But number one, the Immaculate Heart of Mary, Jesus in the Eucharist, and Jesus in the poor. Number two, the very notion, you could explore this, the very notion of religious or consecrated life in general, and all the different orders with their different charisms and callings within the unified body of Christ. As Mother Teresa puts it, I can do things you cannot, you can do things I cannot. Together we can do great things. Number three, you can also explore the background, the particular religious communities of the Jesuits and the Loreto sisters in which Teresa was formed, both paternal and maternal, both intellective and mystic or contemplative. Number 4, of course, the dark night of the soul and the ascent of Mount Carmel, as well as, I'm glad you mentioned Bonaventure's Journey to the Mind of God. There are all these ascent narratives throughout Christian history. Even Ignatian spiritual exercises would be included as one of those, like coming closer to God through a series of steps. St. John Climacus is the ladder of divine ascent. It's not always going upward, I suppose, but it's that is as with spiritual exercise. But it's always a sort of progress, right? And so it can be explored in terms of that. 5, the notion of thirst for Christ, as we have been exploring today, which has been so wonderful and eye-opening. I had no idea that it had so many elements to it. It's wonderful. Number 6, the identification of the poor and those in need. Who is my neighbor? As I felt listening to Father James Brent talk and then listening to Father Brian this morning, I'm thinking, gosh, who's this for? I can't do what Mother Teresa can do, and she can't do what I can do, so who are my poor, right? The identification of the poor. Who are those people that I need to be serving? Number 7. This we briefly touched upon. This is a little bit more recent last year than this year, a little bit more removed, but human touch and physical contact right after a global pandemic. But just in general, like person-to-person interaction and touch. 8, the spirituality of the caregiver. And 9, many more lessons from the poor. We're told that the poor teach us in a real, tangible way how utterly dependent upon and in need of God we all are. This is something we've been reflecting on more today as well. All of these things are well worth examining. Maybe we can mark up a list or something and just have, maybe we can just, it's like like you'd do not a bingo card, but what's that card? Like you bet on lots, or what is it called? A pool, like a betting pool, and you go around, like just mark your name if you're going to do this category, all right? We'll send one around at the end of the day. All right, all these are well worth examining. And as Mother Teresa, in her own words, says, finally, let us begin. We have only today. Let us begin. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll pass the microphone around for anyone who has questions.
Go easy on me.
No, very simple question. Thank you very much. We're also struggling to understand what this darkness means. Just simple question. If the Mother Teresa was struggling with spiritual darkness, does it mean that she was just a genius in spiritual life? She was always seeking Jesus 24 hours, 7 days. So compared to other people, maybe compared to other people are always in spiritual darkness, but people don't recognize it. So how do you, from scientific point of view, compare her problem and others? Isn't it simply because she's just genius, so she's a little bit struggling? Maybe she couldn't get a clear message when she heard. She heard when she was young, and opening up mission and charity. But maybe that's messaging, in and out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, yeah, it's interesting. I took from your question, maybe you can clarify this, but there might be a third possibility here that maybe she's just very ultra-sensitive to darkness that maybe we all have. That's an interesting question as to whether that's the case, right? Maybe she was just, because of her formation and upbringing, or just her natural constitution, the way she was, just the way she was her. Maybe we all have that darkness in us, but she experienced it more profoundly than any of us. Of course, if you wanted to go that way, the philosopher in me is thinking, you'd have to sort of change what you think about what God's doing with her. Is God doing that with all of us? I mean, I'd hope, right? But at that point, it's not a special gift, it's a general gift given to everybody. And yeah, I've not thought about that. Is that getting your question, your understanding right? Okay, yeah. Yeah, I'd think more about that. But that's really interesting. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? All right. Watch out.
As a philosopher looking at depression and then the spiritual darkness, where would they intersect so that you'd be deceived in those things and saying maybe it's one or the other, it might be both, who knows?
Absolutely can be both. Yes. I think in this case, it's very easy to say it's one or the other because there's not much overlap at all. But there are some symptoms that might be similar, right? But even in St. John of the Cross's prologue to the Ascent in the Dark Night, he identifies by name melancholy, and he says, that's not what I'm talking about. So he knows what it is. He's no slouch. He knows that people suffer from that. It's an affective condition that overwhelms people. But that's not the same as this. And while you may experience desolation of God's felt presence, of the senses, you're being purgated and drawn close to God, but you don't feel that you are. While you're experiencing that, that may lead to you feeling a little bummed. Of course, why wouldn't it? So it does share that a little bit of overlap. And when it overlaps, that's when it's really hard to identify which is which. That's where, I think that's where priests, pastors come in, right? Because you can go to a psychologist or psychiatrist and get counsel about the psychological side, all right? So they can help me determine whether it's that. But assuming this thing is something quite different, it's spiritual, they can't tell me anything about that. So I need counseling about if it is rather this than that, or maybe just a little bit of overlap. Maybe I should talk to both, all right? Actually, when I was shadowing a clinical psychologist that summer, I had asked him, suppose you think depression has like religious or spiritual cause. What would you say to that person? I mean, you could just treat it with drugs, sure, but like to get at the root, what would you do? Who would you send them to? Because there's no I asked him. We were at a clinic that was more mental, psychological than medical, and I said, are there any chaplains here? You have that for the medical stuff, but do you have mental health chaplains? And no, we don't have that. So who would you send them to? And he said, my uncle. And I said, okay, say more. What are you talking about? I knew there was something else. He said, my uncle is a licensed clinical psychologist and an ordained Baptist minister. So it's one of the rare individuals that has training in both, and that would be nice if we had more of that. But with uber specialization disciplines, you're unlikely to get it. But in the absence of that, you should probably have a talk with each kind of and helpful discernment about what it is, especially when there's overlap. Yeah. All right. Any other questions?
Well, this is really maybe a question for everybody at large, but in the opening excerpts from her writings that you were quoting at the very beginning in the opening part of your talk, there was a line where she says something to the effect, is this the passion that you wished to impress on my soul? Mm-hmm. So it seems from that she had some sense that at some point Jesus asked or said he was going to impress his passion on her soul. Probably maybe asked for her fiat, and she probably gave it.
That's consistent with what was said, of course, yeah.
It seems then that if all that's true, from a spiritual point of view, we have an explanation.
Absolutely.
Which is just Jesus impressed his passion on her soul.
Right.
I just put that out there for...
No, I 100% agree.
This is what I was quoting
yeah.
last night, Dionysius. Hierotheus not only learned divine things, but he suffered them. Mother Teresa not only heard about the passion and not only heard about conformity to the cross and the possibility of it, by grace, but she got it at a very high level.
Yeah. That's 100%, I 100% agree with you. That explains. And at that point, if you go back to, if we assume dark night of the soul, well, we don't have to assume very much because we've got a lot of great evidence that that's what she received.
Yeah.
Something along those lines, at least of a spiritual nature, that it wasn't psychological.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, that your paper is helpful. It gives us that negative conclusion, which is important. This is not just a psychological thing going on.
And that's important too, not merely psychological. Obviously, we're unified holistic beings, and anything that touches us spiritually is going to not leave us psychologically untouched, right? So that's why it's so hard to deal with these distinctions. Again, there's no blood test. You could have the flu and you could have COVID. We can determine which one you got, which one entered your body, but you can't do that really with mental disorders, right? It's a disordering of whatever is here. You had this here, and it's all out of whack. It's all out of order. So how did that happen, right? That would be the psychological disorder, and it's not neatly fine drawn lines. But in any case, sorry.
Yeah, it's just, I wonder how far we'll get in understanding her interior situation or interior experience insofar as we try to classify her on a grid that systematic theology gives us.
Right.
It seems like her own writings kind of contain the explanation when you read them in light of principles that aren't like the grid system. Like, does she go in this category or this category or go there?
Yeah.
No, there's dynamic principles of growth and grace. And
Absolutely.
she grew to a pretty high level, like you were saying, like a genius, and heaven was using her for purposes that pretty significant.
Mm-hmm. And that could be definitive, that was the seventh level. If you just look at that, the seventh criterion he gives, what's this for? In and of itself, does it bring about humility, charity, kindness, and growth in Christ? And just look, what happened? Yes, absolutely, yeah. Were there some other people back here that wanted to ask something?
Well, I was just going to say that I'm sure that, obviously God knew from all eternity that Mother Teresa was going to be a very well-known figure. And I remember when she passed away, it came out in the paper about her spiritual darkness. So this became a sort of a topic of discussion for people in the world. And I think it put a lot of people on the spot because many people they're just kind of looking for sort of a happy pillow in their lives, for their marriage, their families, going to Mass, the liturgy. It's got to be, hey, if this is boring, I'll just go to a non-denominational church where everybody's jumping up and down, clapping, and everything seems to be so great. So I really think that God used her for much more than she ever could have imagined. So, it's an ever unfolding gift to all of us, and it's also a way of helping us to persevere in our own spiritual lives because we go through our own ups and downs. And it's also a reminder that, many people, if they just observe her from the outside, they probably never would have guessed, well, she's going through all these trials. But it's a reminder to us that we don't always know what's going on in other people's lives. And we see many people today who are just completely, now it's becoming more and more public. You see it more and more. People are just completely going in all kinds of bizarre directions. And it's a reflection of what is happening to the interior lives of people in our society. So, and she has the answer, of course, and that is Christ himself. So anyway, I just wanted to make that observation.
Yeah, thank you for that. What you say makes me think of this obvious contrast between, this, in terms of her darkness, a desolate interior life, but on the outside looking perfect. I mean, she was a saint. And then today we have people who, are going after things, they're in, the other way around. Her interior life was full of prayer, and the exterior, she was poor. But here, today, we have people who are seeking the exterior, right? They're seeking the pleasures, but interiorly, they're just dead, right? They're hollow, And so maybe that's a lesson about seeking pleasure, seeking consolation, as you were suggesting. Sorry.
I had never seen what Mother Teresa was going on in her brain. And when I see that as a woman, I'm thinking she's not depressed. She is distressed because she doesn't understand, because she did love Jesus in a very palatable way. And then to write to her spiritual guides, and they say to her, because she thinks this is God talking to her through them, don't worry, this is my plan, so okay, full steam ahead. But I would say anyone who's been in any kind of vocation for a long time, whether it's religious or marriage, it starts out as a feeling, but if it doesn't develop into a decision, you're not going to stick with it. And I think for the sake of her soul to merit a high place in heaven, that was a gift to God from her, so that she would work in the darkness and become a great saint, strictly for her own merit. And also in association with the Passion of Jesus, where for a time there, Jesus on the cross doesn't even feel the Father's presence anymore as a victim soul, that she also could join him in not feeling any presence of God, even though he's behind a dark wall, he is there. But not to feel that is another thing to offer in union with Jesus to make her the great saint that she is.
Yeah, that's great you put it in terms of vocation. We could add that to the list of things that, comparing this to not just the affect, the feeling of going into, say, a marriage or a religious vocation, but you've got to be more willful and determined and long-lasting than that, even when the hard times come. She can teach us that great lesson. Yeah. All right, any other questions? Still got a little bit more time. Or comments, if you like. Yeah, go ahead. Microphone over here.
Thank you very much, and I think we've been touching on it a little bit, but I was just wondering if you could expand about emotions and the spiritual life. I think we've sort of been skirting around it, and sort of when people talk about the spiritual life, I think sometimes they equate it just with an emotional high. And if you could just talk a little bit about that relationship and how that how we should be thinking about that.
Gosh. I can only say so much, and the next person can say much more, depending on their background and their emotional constitution. But what comes to mind is that, obviously, in the spiritual life, you're not just supposed to experience just one emotion. And so it's not surprising that you would, at one time, experience happiness, and another time experience deep, deep, deep sorrow, and desolation even. And so what surprises us is just that it lasted so long. And well, I say the darkness, the presence, the felt presence lasted so long, not the sorrow. But did you have anything that's more specific than that? Because it's my contention that she probably was not sad, generally speaking, throughout her life. And that seems to be evident. So just with respect to the affects, the passions, the emotions, sadness, well, she could have been all over the place, she could have been happy and so on, generally throughout life. But are you maybe have in mind that maybe in the growth of her spiritual life, there was more sadness maybe than happiness? Is that what you're thinking?
I haven't studied her writings, so I can't say that, but in general, the emotions are not a guide to the spiritual life, is basically what I was getting at.
Absolutely.
It's a part of it, but it's not the guide to the spiritual life. Our spiritual life isn't about, our emotional life, and that they're two distinct realities, and and that as we see this, and I think what she's talking about with this darkness is that it's not an emotional component.
Absolutely.
It's a different sense of the wondering, well, and I can just imagine the wondering of, well, seeing all of this abject horror around her. I mean, I just returned from Ukraine, and just seeing, 2 blocks away, a bombed out building, and you see the utter face of evil, right in front of you, but yet, it's not an emotional reaction to our spiritual life. And
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Maybe Father Brian?
I was just going to say, I think one of the other things, one of maybe a few many things that Mother teaches is exactly what Father Mark was saying about the role of feelings, because in an era that is so dominated by feelings and how I feel and decisions I make because of how I feel, even our English language, well, how do you feel about that?
Right.
And then there's one little story, I think it was by a priest, and they were getting ready to leave one convent in one city, and a sister was being transferred, and the people that they were serving, I think it was maybe children or women, and this sister was very well loved, and all the people are crying, and it's a big emotional scene, and the priest asked her, well, Mother, I mean, what look at this, and what, maybe not to change or something. And Mother said something like, well, if I depended on how the feelings and how things are according to feelings, I would be lost or something. It was like, I would never be able to do anything.
Yeah. Yeah. That goes back to what we were saying over here, One's commitment is not based on feeling. Yeah. I really like that. Yeah. What was the way you put it? The spiritual life is not dependent on emotion. And that's not guided by emotion. They can certainly be present and make it much more beautiful and filled out. Absolutely. And a lot of Christ's love just comes to remake things. And so it can transform loves into greater loves, right? And redeem sorrow. But it's not the primary point of things, right? Just to have the great emotional highs or something and avoid the lows, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe Father Bob can say
I think
something
your turn.
about... Huh?
Okay, your turn.
No, I'm saying we have like 5 minutes. Father Bob might mention something about, because there's discernment, and like Ignatian discernment, and it's based on, what's movements and what's going on in your soul or something. I don't know, Father Bob, if I put you on the spot here, but...
Yeah, that's Ignatian indifference, trying to stand in the center and not be influenced by emotion and your personal history, or sometimes we call it like, what voices are you listening to? Your past, your present, personal sicknesses, depression? Is it the Holy Spirit? Is it the evil spirit who's trying to speak, who's trying to enter in, trying to find that place of neutrality within? And in part, that seems to be that vow of 1942, where she says, never refuse Jesus, which in general, missionaries of charity interpret that as just an impossible aim, because it seems to be linking her to some kind of impossible perfection. How can I never refuse Jesus anything? And she's vowing herself, upon pain of mortal sin, to never refuse him. But it may be better seen in the light of discernment, which is to say, I always want to do God's will, no matter what I feel, no matter what's going on around me. Only God's will, that's everything there is for me, and I'm binding myself to God's will upon pain of mortal sin. That's pretty radical. Yeah. And 4 years after, and that's also at the same time Father Van Exum, even though he was a trained Islamic scholar, he's come into Archbishop Perrier saying, well, right before the inspiration day seemed like, to me, she's almost in ecstasy, or the sixth mansion of St. Teresa of Avila. So this is all going on at the same time, as well as this incredible darkness.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I don't know about you guys, but this is almost kind of a retreat for me. Normally, I just do academic papers and teaching, so this is much more formative than normal for me, and I hope it's been the same for you. So thank you.
Please join me.